Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Counting on Chazin. We're delighted you're here with us today as we talk about nonprofit budgeting tips with Martha Huelsbeck. Martha, welcome back to another episode with us.
Great to be back.
Hey, you've taught us so much, and today we're going to really get back into something that is one of those things that I think we know. We think we know a lot about, but maybe we don't. And that's budgeting for the nonprofit organization. So we're really appreciative to get all of your advice and your sage wisdom. Let's get right into it. And we got to start off by asking the question, are nonprofits required to have a budget, a formalized budget?
Sometimes, but usually that's when there's a governance requirement or a grantor has a requirement for their specific piece. But generally, no, there is no regulation that requires a nonprofit to have a budget.
Okay, interesting. So I can see why this might kind of go to the bottom of the list if we're not worried about being in compliance. But I got to believe nonprofits need a budget. And why do they need a budget? Let's maybe start there as well.
Well, every nonprofit has a mission, and to deliver that mission, you have to have a plan to get there. So you need to think about the resources available, and you need to think about what it's going to cost you to deliver that mission. So those are sort of the basic elements of the budget. Therefore, even if you don't have a formal budget, hopefully you have one floating around in your head as the leader of that organization.
So if you can help me with that, I mean, it seems to me you can have a really sophisticated budget or a not so sophisticated budget. Are you kind of saying, let's start somewhere and let's figure out like who's creating that? Because this involves a lot of information. So when we're working on a shoestring staff wise, maybe we're working with a lot of volunteers. Our boards probably all, volunteer. Who is creating this work and how are we going about this?
I would always recommend a team approach to budgeting, particularly if you've never done it before. You don't have to have everyone involved all of the time, but there should be inputs coming from different places. And actually, the financial mind or financial person in the organization may come in well behind the other parts of the organization who are thinking about mission. What programs do you want to deliver? So that's where you need to have different people come in and think about, what are we trying to do? And then you can start talking about numbers.
Mm-hmm. I love that because it seems to me it also lightens the load, and that if you can get more of a team approach, maybe it's not such a daunting thing to think about and to begin. So that leads me to my next piece. Like, where do we start? Like, where do we even begin to take on this task?
Well, once you've identified kind of who the key players are going to be in the process, I would start with a narrative process, just writing down, what we plan to do for the next year. And typically I would start with a 1-year budget. I wouldn't do anything more than that to start, and just, just a description of what we're going to do, how we think we're going to do it, and then, who you can start getting into the details and breaking down those narratives further and further into smaller pieces.
Mm-hmm. That's smart. It seems to me when you begin that way, maybe you open the door to non-accounting types, folks that aren't on. If you have a finance committee, you probably get more all hands on deck. Does that make sense?
Yeah, actually, absolutely. At the beginning stages, like I said, a lot of times the financial person doesn't even need to be involved when you're sort of defining the plan for the year in a narrative form. Mm-hmm. And that's actually, if you have the resources to do that, I would recommend that you do it that way first, at the programming side of the organization, start the process.
Interesting. Okay. Well, with that in mind, what are you recommending, especially for those organizations that might not really be sophisticated about this, or maybe more on the beginning side of this track? How detailed should this be? And the next follow-up question I've got to ask is this set in concrete, or can we revise it? I mean, how is it? So many things that we do are living, breathing, as we call documents, but the budget, it seems like that's pretty set in stone, or am I wrong?
Well, typically, well, let's see, where should we start? I guess in, ter-
Let's start with the detail, because I
in
think
terms of
that,
details.
yeah.
So in terms of details, I would start out pretty high level.
Yeah.
What are we going to do? So how much, what kind of resources or what kind of revenue do we need in order to deliver that? And
Okay.
then think about where that revenue might come from. But then when you get into the details of cost, I would start with my biggest costs first. And in almost all our nonprofit organizations, people are your most expensive costs. So start breaking it down. Who do we have now? Who else do we need in order to deliver this mission, and start breaking it down with a lot of support, on the people side. And once you get past the people and the fringe costs associated with people, you could easily have, 80 to 85% of your total costs there, and you're, in some ways almost done.
Yeah. I love that, because that, again, very achievable. It's something that we need to know anyway, so that we can keep our people, and that we can stay on, track with providing our service. But then let's move forward. I mean, when you talked about people, my first thought is the great resignation and how we're having a lot of changes with our costs, and in terms of recruiting, retention, even offering benefits. That kind of leads me into the next part of the question. And maybe I jumped the gun a little bit, but that's about revisions, and how do we keep that budget updated, or is this something that we don't change and we measure ourselves against at the end of that period?
Well, it kind of depends a little bit on, the relationship between the, operating side of the organization and the governance side of the organization. A lot of times the governing board will have a budget that is set, that's been approved, and you start to deliver against that budget. But from an operations standpoint, so many things can happen, as we've learned over the last couple of years, to make a budget obsolete, before the year starts in many cases. So I would recommend, if you do have a process where a budget is set, either, a budget revision process that's agreed upon by all parties, or an ongoing forecasting process where you're looking at, this is what's happened to date, this is what's left in the budget, but that's not what's going to happen. What's really going to happen here? So a combination of a budget that's probably fairly set, and then a forecasting process to revisit that fairly often.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here because it's so interesting. Several of our other Chazin and Company guests on Counting on Chazin, they have used this word forecasting, and I'd love to kind of throw you a curveball a little bit, and ask you maybe to refine that, or not refine, but explain it, because it seems to me when I think of budgeting, it's very black and white. There's none of this like narrative piece. So it's surprising to me to have you explain, start off with a narrative, which I think is brilliant. But the forecasting seems to me like that's more of a narrative position, or am I wrong on that?
Well, certainly forecasting or reforecasting, it's the same thing. It starts with a narrative. Okay,
Okay.
so we know that we're going to have to shut down, and we're not going to have any revenue at the door. Say you're an arts organization. So, you talk about that, and then you start to go back to your budget and say, well, we projected to have, this much in receipts for our programs. We're not going to have those programs, so we need to make an adjustment. So forecasting, yes, it talks about what's changed, and you have to talk about that with words. You can't just talk about it with numbers. Certainly, people cost, as you mentioned, has changed a lot over the last few years.
Yeah.
So you do that, and then you start to say, well, how will that affect, our budget? How will it affect our revenue? How will it affect our costs? And it's a refinement process that goes on sort of over time. Always looking ahead. There's nothing to refine in the past about a budget. You have your actuals, and you may or may not have made your budget, but that's not really where the focus is. The focus is what's going to happen next.
Interesting. It almost sounds to me a little bit like using a different word is scenario planning, which we think of that as very narrative. And it seems like a lot of times we don't marry the concept of budgeting with scenario planning. So I think it's a really interesting thing to be talking about because we're still in a post-COVID environment. We're facing potential economic changes on a national or global scale. So a lot of these things are going to possibly impact our organizations, and I think it's a good idea to be evaluating how you might change or not re-navigate things. It's a
Yeah, absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. I think that's a great way to describe it.
Yeah, pretty interesting. Now, one of the things that I want to kind of move on to, and again, this is more of a drill down into the budgeting thing. You reminded me that there's really a big difference between the program costs and the overhead costs, and that we should be pretty specific about separating these out. And I think that a lot of organizations kind of lump these things together. And I'm wondering if you could kind of share some insight with us about that.
Well, so overhead costs is another way to think about that. Is it's indirect, or the program itself doesn't drive that cost in any direct way. So you have certain things, like you may have a rented space, and all of your programs are really run out of that rented space. Yet if you added another program, you probably wouldn't add space costs like that. So it's indirectly related to what you're actually delivering on your mission or your programs. So your overhead costs are typically, in the budgeting process, are typically set aside from the planning of that year's delivery of mission. You need to revisit to see if you need additional overhead to expand your programming, or if you're going to be able to take some of it away if you have to retract some of your programming. But generally, it's kind of two separate planning processes that then need to be put together.
Interesting. And I would imagine this would help you when you report back out for funding or even measuring what your success has been like or replicating a program. I mean, does that make sense? Or is that how your budget can impact you there? Or is that really another way of evaluating what you're doing?
No, absolutely. If you're trying to do an analysis of whether a program, was effective,
Mhm.
typically you would not load it up with overhead costs and say, well, that it was going really well, but then we have all this overhead costs, and that really ruined the program. So that's not typically the kind of analysis you do when you're analyzing a program itself.
Mhm.
But it is, if you are almost fully grant funded or something like that, you do need to think about your overhead costs, because you have to include that somehow in your overall plan, because you can't, there's really no such thing as an organization without overhead, unless you just deliver one program. So
Right, right,
the cost is shared, across all the different things you do.
right. Well, and I think it makes the organization a little bit more murky in terms of how you grow or how you replicate the program, how you share your success, your processes, maybe with another organization in a completely different part of the country or even the world. If you haven't been able to pull some of those things out, you might kind of be in trouble in terms of really evaluating what's gone on, right?
But oh yes, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Really, really important. Okay, so we've talked about managing or crafting the budget. Um, Now I've got to ask you about managing the budget. because it seems like almost like a strategic plan, and that I can see a lot of work goes into it, and then it gets set off and doesn't really get reviewed except by maybe your accounting provider, or bookkeeper, kind of like at the end of the day. And I'm wondering if maybe you could give us some tips on how an organization can really be looking at this and understanding if they're even on track.
Well, it's really important once you have your budget, whether it's an overall organization budget or it's a budget on a program or a grant, that you're looking at how you're tracking against that budget. Because if you're tracking negatively against that budget, then you have to figure out, can we continue the way we're going, or do we need to make a revision in our delivery? Sometimes the revision is in the numbers, but that can only take you so far. And then you have to think about revision in the delivery. So it's really important, and it would be a waste of all your time budgeting if you didn't use that budget as a tool to analyze, how things are going, and also to think about the future. So if the first 5 months have been like this, what's going to happen the rest of the year? And that starts you into that forecasting process. So typically reporting against budget gives you some of what you need to go ahead and think about, okay, we need to relook at these costs or relook at this revenue in the forecasting context.
So then let me tag on another question to that. When you talk about forecasting, and we understand it's probably more of a narrative, right, than adjusting the numbers, or is it? And then are we talking about doing this monthly or quarterly? What does that lens look like in terms of moving out?
Well, no, I mean, it is scenario discussion, as you mentioned, but then you do need to put the pen to the paper and figure out numerically, what that means, because ultimately, if you don't have some additional source of funds and you're running negative on your costs, then you're going to run out of money and something's going to happen. So it's important that you take those scenario discussions and translate them numerically so that you can see kind of how you'll end up.
Mm-hmm.
It also, it has a lot of times there's assigned responsibility related to budget. So if you're tracking negatively to budget,
Yeah.
a board may come in and say, look, you only have this much. So then you're thinking about, okay, if I only have that much, then I need to figure out how to spend that if it's not how I thought I was going to spend it. So I think it's important that there's a lot of conversation, but there also has to be some numbers to kind of show where you're going.
Martha, I appreciate you saying that, because it seems to me so many more nonprofits across this country are using CEO dashboards. And that is a standard report, if you will, that is distributed at the same time every month to board members, sometimes even to C-suite or stakeholders in some cases. But it seems to me like this should be part of that. It may be not in its entirety, but some part of the budget and the performance should be on that dashboard. Is that something you would agree with, or is that too much of a heavy lift?
No, I mean, absolutely. When we have a dashboard for clients, we always, one of the fundamental reports is what we would call a budget versus actual. So, we're 3 months through the year, we're 6 months through our budget.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we need to revisit something, but that should appear, quickly in your management tools and in your governance tools also, that those things can be seen. So absolutely, you want that to be part of your dashboard.
Another thing I'm thinking of too, as you're talking about this, it seems to me that before you go too far down the path, you should have this structure reviewed by whoever your accounting provider is. I mean, would you agree with that, or is it something that is really best to complete the process and then to get your accounting provider involved?
So if you want to use your budget as a tool and look at how you're tracking against that, your budget needs to be in the structure that you're tracking revenue and cost.
Yes.
So, and it's not unusual to see budget thinking and budget numbers go a different direction than accounting, but then it becomes a manual process to essentially remap what's happened and what's been accounted for against the budget. So ideally, yes, you get your accounting person involved so that they can, work alongside you to make sure that the budget fits in with the way costs have been structured. And
Yeah.
that may result in a different tracking of costs. If the organization is really going a different way, you may change the way you track costs. And that's also something you need to do hand in hand with your accountant.
Yeah. It seems to me that if you do a little bit of this work up front, you're going to maybe even at the end of the day save some money because, like to your point, and I think you used the word tracking, you'll be tracking together, right? I mean, does that make sense so that you'll be kind of rowing in the same direction?
Right. Best case scenario, the budget is approved, it's put into your system, and the budget versus actual tracking automatically comes out. It goes to the dashboard. It can be looked at any point in time. That's the best way to do it so that someone doesn't have to sit and map things together. And it just takes time, and it certainly takes money to do that. So ideally, you have a budget, it's in your system, and it automates the whole process so that you can get that data as quickly as possible and use it in making operating decisions.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. It really kind of goes back to my very first and second questions is, do we have to have it and why do we have it? And I think you've just answered a lot of this is that it dovetails into how we're managing our organizations, how we're reporting. So many of your colleagues have spoken to us on Counting on Chazin about transparency and building trust. It seems like this becomes one of those tools that you're actually not only using but you're sharing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no reason to hide. You need to share with, you know, the organization and the decision makers, how things are going and where there are problems and where there are things to celebrate and, maybe do some additional program. It's not always negative. So,
I love that. I love that you use the word celebrate because that's a great concept. It's been so tough for so many nonprofits having to pivot during COVID and all of the changes that we are living through right now. I appreciate you saying that because that's something that a lot of times there's so much fear around numbers and accounting and these compliance issues um, that we can lose sight of how this information can help us really understand that we are doing well and that we are achieving our mission, vision, and values.
yeah,
It's pretty awesome. Martha Huelsbeck, CPA, Talent Recruitment and Development Manager for Chazin and Company. Thank you so much for coming back on with us and talking us through the process of budgeting and giving us some budgeting tips. This is one of those key things that all nonprofits that are really wanting to grow and be successful and be accountable need to understand. And Martha, you've really painted a great picture for us and given us some new information. Thank you so much.
you're welcome.
I'm Julia Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy. Thanks so much for joining us today. Counting on Chazin and chazinandcompany.com. There's a lot more information that you will find about how to make your nonprofit more successful. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you back here again.